All right, Assalamu alaikum, everyone, or to all the participants of today's training. We're talking about reimagining Indus Water Treaty in the context of global water security. And our all right, sorry. डॉक्टर साहब अनम्यूट कर लें अपने आप को
जी जी ठीक है
all right sorry for that all right basically the abstract of it is that Dr. Saab, our esteemed guest Dr. Zafar Adeel will give a little bit he'll talk on the Indus Water Treaty in the context of international policies and in world communities thinking on water security, its global impact, and UN Security Council. So let me give a brief intro of our esteemed speaker today. He is currently the Executive Director, Pacific Water Research Center. He's also a professor of professional practice at the School of Resources and Environmental Management at the Simon Fraser University. Mashallah, he has 18 years of experience as United Nations official, mostly in the international development research, being director of United Nations University Institute of Water, Environment and Health. He has been a chair at UN Water Group for about 60 organizations, a co-chair of Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Team for rural and for scarce water-related countries. He has also been working in the development of South-South network of rural and remote communities, Africa, Middle East, and Pakistan, and Asia. As well, he's also a series editor for book series on water security in a new world. So today we have a person who is majorly an authentic and global name in water and its issues. So now I hand over to Dr. Zafar Adeel Saab. Sir, the floor is yours and the session is yours.
जी thank you very much Hassan. Assalamu alaikum everyone. आपसे सबसे मिलके virtually बहुत खुशी हुई. I'll start my presentation in English and then the Q&A we can do in English, Urdu, Punjabi, whatever your pleasure takes. So thank you again for the kind introduction. So what I will do is I want to talk about the Indus Water Treaty and the relationship between not just India and Pakistan, but also with China and with Afghanistan. And this is a conversation that needs to take place in the context of what's happening in the rest of the world. And so I'll start off talking about the global water security issues, and then that will be the basis for the discussion on Indus Water Treaty and the Indus Water Basin. So it's a great pleasure. I'm very grateful to NESPAC to having arranged this opportunity to share some ideas and thoughts with you. And I hope that these ideas will lead to some active discussion. And I'm really looking forward to that. I have ample time after I'm done talking, which will probably take about, I would say about 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time. The work that I'm presenting today is mostly based on a book that I co-edited with my colleague Robert Bursing from the US on the Indus Basin, and this was published about 3 years ago. It is available if you're interested in learning a lot more about what's happening in the Indus Basin and also what the future prospects are. So my talk is going to be in 5 sort of distinct parts. As I said, I'll start talking about the global water security issues and the politics behind it and how it actually works. Then I'll go into the Indus Basin, what the challenges are, and I'm sure all of you are familiar to some extent what these challenges are. I would still like to go through them just to make sure that all of us have the same understanding and we are at the same page. I would also spend a bit of time on what the opportunities are in terms of how things can be done differently, and I'll particularly focus on 4 areas of opportunity. these opportunities have to be balanced against some political realities of, you know, the geopolitical realities, the conflicts, the tussles between different countries, and tussles within countries as well. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts and ideas of where we can go from here. I will also talk about what is the role for engineers in moving forward. One thing I will only touch on briefly is the management of water inside of Pakistan. So that is not really my theme. I'm quite happy to expand on that particular area, but I'll give you a heads up right up front that my presentation is mostly about the international management of the Indus River Basin. Okay, so let's get started. Let's start with the giving you a picture of the politics of the global water security. So this notion of water security is not really that old. The first time somebody spoke about it was at the World Water Forum in The Hague in the Netherlands in the year 2000, when this concept was first introduced. Then it took almost 10 years for the UN system to catch up on this notion. And UN Water, which is a coordination mechanism that connects the workings of about 35 different UN organizations and another 36 or 37 international organizations dealing with water issues. So I was quite fortunate at the time. I was chairing this group, and we declared water security as the top priority action area for the UN. And then 2 years later, the UN created a task force. And again, I was quite privileged to be asked to co-chair this task force, which I did from 2012 to 2016. So water security is something that has really been a fairly significant part of my professional endeavor, at least for the last 10, 12 years. In 2011, there's a group called Interaction Council, which met. And this Interaction Council is basically former heads of state. And this is the picture that you see on the top. And you can probably recognize slightly right of the center, and Bill Clinton is one of the members. And there's a number of former heads of state from different countries. The gentleman sitting in the front, Mr. John Chrétien, who's a former Canadian Prime Minister, was chairing this group. And this group basically decided that water security was an issue of global significance. And you can imagine that these are all heads of state, and they can focus their attention on what they think is going to be problematic or a major challenge for the world as a whole. UNESCO has an intergovernmental hydrological program that also in 2012 started to focus on water security. Also in 2012, the US intelligence community put forward an assessment on global water security. And I'll come back and I'll talk a bit more about what is it that they said in this assessment. In 2013, there was a high-level event at the UN General Assembly. Lots of world leaders were present. And in 2015, this UN task force that I was co-chairing started to organize regional dialogues on water security. So it kind of gives you a sense of how the political importance on water security gradually increased. In 2016, for the very first time, the UN Security Council held a special session on water, peace, and security. And the UN Secretary General said that we have to commit to invest in water security as a means to achieve peace. In 2017, a year later, there was another session and a debate in water security. And once again, there was a focus on using water as a catalyst for cooperation, not really for conflict. And that, in a way, is kind of the sub-theme of my talk today as well. And fast forward to 2018, UN Security Council for a third time had another session on water, peace, and security. So these are, again, UN Security Council only talks about conflicts and wars and those kind of issues. It has started focusing on climate change in the last 5 years. and it has also started focusing on water security. So that gives you a sense that there is an understanding in the international leadership that water security is an important aspect. And another way of recognizing this significance was the announcement of an international decade for action on water, which started in March of 2018. There's quite a few global mechanisms that have cropped up in the last 10 to 15 years. And this notion of water being a global problem is relatively recent. I mean, there was obviously focus on water for a long time internationally, but this is the first time that water is being recognized as a global issue. And it's global in terms of its economic impact. So if there's a flood or a drought in one part of the world, it affects another part. But it's also geographical because, as we know, climate change, which is a global process, causes major impacts on the hydrological cycle. And you see that these changes are manifesting in different parts of the world at the same time. So again, it's that works towards the globality of this issue. In response, there have been a number of these global scale institutions. UN Water, I've already mentioned. There's also the World Water Council, which organizes these major forums every 3 years, and they attract anywhere from 25 to 35,000 people every year, every third year internationally. So it's a gathering of global water community. Similarly, World Bank set up this Global Water Partnership, which has now offices, I think, in about 78 countries, and it's out working with a lot of governments to help them on their water security issues. There are also some global advocacy platforms. As you might know, UN General Assembly declared water as a human right in 2010, and then a number of other things resulted from that. There was a high-level panel on water, which was set up in 2016. And World Water Day is celebrated every year on 22nd of March to mark various water issues. So the topic of water security has really gone global. Here's another view of what the world's leadership thinks of water security. Every year, world's business leaders and many political leaders gather in Davos in Switzerland in the World Economic Forum, and they talk about the emerging issues and challenges. One of the things they do is to rank different threats that the world is facing, and they rank them on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of the likelihood of their happening and also in terms of their relative magnitude or their impact. And for the last 4 or 5 years, water issues and water crises have figured pretty much at the top of this. So if you look at the top quadrant of this image, water crises is actually listed as a threat, which is not only quite likely to happen, but it also will create a lot of impact. But I'll go a step further. There's other things which are up in this quadrant, particularly these green diamonds, which actually are also quite related to water. So when we look at extreme weather, for example, floods, hurricanes, cyclones, these are all water-related extreme weather events. Similarly, natural disasters include floods, and man-made environmental disasters are also related to water. So water is actually quite central to both the business community and to the political leadership. Here's a reason why they are paying so much attention. It's the sheer magnitude of water-related problems. So I'll explain what this graph is. It basically tabulates the number of people affected by a problem, the number of people killed by a problem, and the relative economic damage. So the size of the circle is proportional to the magnitude of the problem. So the left side of the image is water-related issues. The first column, if you will, is related to water and sanitation problems. Then you have drought and flooding. On the right-hand side, there are other disasters, just to give you a sense of magnitude. And this data is, I think, about 3 years old, and I'll explain what that relates to the current situation. So if you look at the number of people affected, and these are annual figures, there's 55 million people every year who are impacted by drought. There's 106 million people every year who are affected by flood. And there's a definition on the right-hand side on the bottom in describing what it means. So people who require immediate assistance, or they're displaced from their homes, etc. Now, if we compare it to earthquakes and epidemics, typically this has been around 6 million. Now we know under the COVID-19 pandemic, the current number as of today is 38 million people. So even if you compare that, 38 million is still smaller than the number of people who are affected by droughts. Armed conflict affects up to 65 million people a year. So again, that's another big driver of impacts. If you go to the lower row and we look at the number of people killed, there's about 780,000 people every year who die from gastrointestinal diseases. And more than half of these are people who are under the age of 5, children under the age of 5. So it has very significant bearing. Drought and flooding have relatively fewer people who are impacted, 6,000 people who are impacted by flooding. And then finally, we look at the economic damage. We don't really know what the economic damage is of people's health problems as a result of drinking water. But we know that flooding, for example, causes cumulative damage of over $30 billion a year. So a lot of impact. So, these are not minor numbers. And imagine the kind of attention which is being paid to this pandemic at the moment. And then you can visualize that water actually matches them, those kind of scale of problems year after year. Now, there's one slot which is empty where it says no data, which is right here. Number of people affected by unsafe water and sanitation. We actually do have that data now, and we know that the number is at least 2 billion. So something like about a quarter of the world's population is impacted by not having safe water and sanitation. That's the reason why the business leaders and the political leaders are very concerned about what's happening with water security. Okay, so I've been now talking about water security in the abstract. I would like to actually define what it means and what are the different components, because this will help us when we get to talk about Indus Basin itself. At the very simplest level, water security is it pertains to the individual experience of assured access to safe water. So it's one individual person's experience of having access to safe water. So that is the basic unit for defining that whether you are water secure or not. And if you look at its components, so that means a person should have enough water for domestic purposes. They should have enough water. Their livelihood is protected, particularly those people who are in the agriculture sector. They have to have enough water. Ecosystems need water to survive and to protect and restore them. So we need to have that. You also need to have water available for different economic activities. So there are separate sectoral needs for different industrial and economic sectors. And you need to have the water be collected and treated. And finally, you also need transboundary water resource management. So when water is crossing national boundaries, you have to have effective ways of managing it. Now, to get all of this done, you need the ability to cope with uncertainties and risks. And I was just showing you what the magnitude of those risks are and how the world's leadership responds to those risks. And you also need legal regimes, you need regulations, legislation, you need institutional arrangements, and you need hard infrastructure to make all of this possible. So the last two bullet points are kind of the enabling elements that you need to have in place. One other clarification I would like to make that I'm so far talking about water security. So it's water security with the small s. But there's also water and security issues. And here I'll say security with a capital S. And in that case, it's the notion of security in terms of conflict and armed intervention, wars, et cetera, et cetera. So that certainly is part of water security, but please don't be misled by the word security because it means everyone has secured access to water. So that's what it means. And UN Water came up with a formal definition, and it took 15 organizations and several months of working to come up with this one definition, which is actually included in this policy brief, and I have included the link to this policy brief here. By the way, I've given my presentation to the colleagues at NESPAC, and I've asked them to share them with everyone who's present here. So you'll have access to this link quite directly. Okay, so now I want to talk about this US intelligence community assessment. And that I think is a very interesting landmark document for a number of reasons. The first one is that this was done by intelligence officials. This is not prepared by water experts. So this was done in 2012. There's 24 intelligence agencies in the US. Yes, the number is 24, in case you didn't know. They all got together and they put together this assessment on global water security. And what they did was they looked at different river basins across the world, and they identified which of those are at risk. And I'll explain in a minute what they envision the risks to be and how those problems could be solved. So the list here, I imagine that you'd be familiar with these basins. Indus Basin, obviously, we've already spoken about, and I'll explain the number of challenges and opportunities in quite a bit more detail. Jordan River, as you probably know, flows from Syria and Lebanon into Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority. Mekong River Commission starts in China, and then it goes through Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, and it goes into the Indian Ocean. Nile has about 10 countries, and it empties through Egypt into the Mediterranean. Tigris-Euphrates is a combined river system that starts in Turkey, goes through Syria and Iraq, and it empties out into the Persian Gulf. Amu Darya is basically the river basin that starts in Tajikistan, goes through Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, and it's used to empty out into Aral Sea, but all the water got diverted during the Soviet Union period, so basically none of the water reaches into that inbound landbound lake. And then final basin here is Brahmaputra basin, which starts in China and goes through India, Bhutan, Nepal, and empties out into the Bay of Bengal through Bangladesh. Now, there's a few interesting points I'll note here just for your interest. Three of these basins, Indus, Mekong, and Brahmaputra, all start in China. And actually, Indus and Mekong have river commissions, and we have the Indus Water Treaty. Brahmaputra doesn't have any treaty, but China is not part of any of these treaty and any of these arrangements. So that's kind of interesting. They also noted the reasons why these countries have inadequate capacity to deal with their water security problems. And for Indus Basin, they said the capacity was moderate, looking mostly, I think, at India and Pakistan and the existing irrigation and water management systems which are in place. But there are other places like Brahmaputra where the capacity is quite inadequate and the risk for problems is quite significant. Incidentally, and I'm sure you're following in news for the last few months, the skirmishes between China and India they are taking place at the origins of the Brahmaputra River Basin. So this has become strategically very critical now. And in some ways, you can say the US intelligence community has forecasted this 8 years ago that this was an area high at risk. So what did these US intelligence officials say? And I'm just summarizing. You're welcome to go look for this report. It's available publicly, although the intelligence people put it together. It's not a secret report. So they said in the next 10 years, and remember this is 2012, water problems will contribute to instability within states, and that will lead to social tensions and weak political institutions, and those will cause a spiral of negative consequences, and countries might implode, meaning that they might lead to internal collapse within those countries. Now, in 2011, as the Arab Spring had started, Syria was impacted, and by 2012, 2013, it was a full-blown civil war. And as you know, that civil war is still continuing. So again, in a way, the assessment came true quite soon for at least one river basin, where which was already pointed out by the U.S. intelligence community. They also said that as water shortages become more acute beyond the next years, water in shared basins will be increasingly used as a lever. So that means water can be used as a weapon, or it could be also a target for terrorists, etc. And they go through some detailed scenarios for what might happen. And if there's time and if there's interest, we can come back and talk about this issue. What they said was that the main driver for water insecurity was food production, and particularly groundwater supplies are at high risk because as surface waters either dry out or you exploit them beyond their capacity, people are now depending on groundwater to make up for the shortfall. But within a period of 10 years, that depletion will be significant enough that you would start to see some impacts in both national and global food markets. And again, we've seen some pretty extreme spikes in food prices for food commodities in the international market. So we know that this is again actually taking place. And the final point, which is quite logical from if you put all of those together, that if you want to relieve water scarcity issues and you want to achieve water security, you need to look at the agricultural water usage in a very serious way, and to look at what that means for both food security and water security for those basins. It's a very interesting report. I would highly advise that you go and take a look at it and read through it. It's not a very long report. Okay, so let's go to the second part of my talk, which is actually now coming to the real subject area, which is the Indus Basin and the Indus Challenge. So, and again, I'll just repeat these basics for the sake of completion. I'm presuming that most of you are familiar. So about 47% of the basin area is in Pakistan, 39% is in India, and of course, Kashmir is a fairly significant part of that disputed territory, which is shown in dark shade on the map here. China has only 8%, and Afghanistan has 6%. And again, I'll come back and I'll talk about what is the significance of having China and Kabul and Afghanistan not be included in the Indus Water Treaty. So again, some basics, and again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with what the Indus Water Treaty, which was signed back in 1960 between the Pakistani and Indian governments, and the World Bank had signed it as a co-signatory and as a mediator between India and Pakistan at the time. And it has a lot of these provisions about financial compensation to Pakistan, for example, which was a compensation for division of water, where we gave the control for Ravi, Sutlej, and Beas to to India, and India was to provide financial compensation to Pakistan, which incidentally they have done through even when we were at war in 1965 and 1971, and at other times when we had high political tensions. That financial compensation process has not stopped. There was things like exchange of data, how future cooperation will take place. The Permanent Indus Commission was formed. Uh, it also had a number of annexures that dealt with some specific issues like hydropower, like agricultural usage. It also introduced the notion of engaging a neutral expert or going to the court of arbitration to resolve any problems that might arise. So all of this is available. I will not spend too much time on this. One point I do want to highlight, the American expert that was hired in the 1950s by the World Bank to develop the Indus Water Treaty had a very different mindset, because he was thinking that India and Pakistan will jointly manage this resource, and they will look at the excess of water which is available at that time, and will manage it in a very friendly way. What came out at the end of almost 8 or 9 years of negotiation in 1960 was actually a division. So it actually went almost in the opposite direction of where the World Bank started from, which was joint management, and it ended up being, leading to this division and bifurcation of the river basin, which was not really the original intention of why this treaty was set up. Now, the world has shifted quite a bit since the treaty was signed, and there's a number of very significant changes. So the most prominent one is the climate patterns have changed. Rainfall patterns have changed. There's forecast that either monsoons will fail some years, or in some years they might be much more extreme than usual. We don't know actually how fast the glaciers are melting, and that's a bit of a mystery. Also, there's not a whole lot of research being done in the region. I know there's some Swiss researchers who are looking at how fast the glaciers are melting, but that leads to uncertainties in how much water will be available 30 years from now or 40 years from now. The Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change generally forecasts that over the next 30 years, the water availability in the Indus Basin will actually increase. And then as the glacier melt slows down, then it will start to slow down. But again, we don't really have very precise numbers for what those forecasts are actually telling us. Okay. The demand has also increased quite significantly, and most of that is because of population increase, but there are other drivers which are leading to increase in water demand. If you just look at population alone, back in 1951, when the negotiation for the Indus Water Treaty had started, the water availability in Pakistan was around, over 5,000 cubic meters per person per year. Now it's actually less than 1,000 cubic meters per person per year, which is actually below the international threshold of water scarcity. So we are just not being able to keep pace with the population growth and to manage our water resources effectively. And of course, that has consequences for agricultural production and food security for the basin as a whole. There are also increased environmental impacts. The water quality is deteriorating. A lot of cities discharge their water without treatment into the river basin. That affects the aquatic life in the river basin, and also the river flow going out at the delta in Sindh has also decreased quite significantly, and has caused all kinds of ecosystem damage at that in that area. And finally, the groundwater depletion is very significant around the Indus Basin. So as I said, some of it is used for irrigation purposes, and of course that leads to dropping of water tables. A large majority, at least in Pakistan, is used for urban consumption. And again, I'm sure there's people here at NASPAC that know a lot more about that kind of withdrawal and its consequences than I do. But it is, at the end of the day, a significant effect, which again was not really explicitly included in the Indus Water Treaty. So the ongoing challenges, as you can imagine, is that the management of the basin is not cooperative at all, and it's India and Pakistan butting their heads all the time, and it's leads to very difficult situation. Data sharing, for example, is impacted as a result of that. The other big problem is that in 1960, when this was signed, there was an excess of water, so it was relatively easy to manage that water. Now we are in a water scarcity situation, and everyone is competing for those resources, and that has resulted in all these disputes. And again, if there's time at the end, I'm quite happy to explain more, at least my understanding of what has happened with the Baglihar Dam, the Kishan Ganga hydroelectric project, and this is probably the most recent one that you heard quite a lot in the newspapers over the last 2 or 3 years. And then there's a whole whack of dams being planned by India, over 30 dams in Kashmir alone. And I'm sure that they will lead to all kinds of conflicts and problems. The Indus Water Treaty doesn't offer anything on water quality, as I said, so water quality control measures are not in place. And at a strategic level, exclusion of Afghanistan and China is, I think, quite problematic. So, for example, we know that China is starting to build dams on its side at the head of Indus Water. What that will do to water availability over the long run, we don't really know. If someone here knows, I would be very happy to hear. But there's kind of a blanket around this, and we don't really know what the long-term plans are for China and how that will impact us. And similarly, we know that the Kabul River that comes into the Indus Basin has been gradually decreasing in its water flow over the last almost 20 years. And we don't, again, really know very well the reasons for why that volume is decreasing. Here's a map produced by the World Resources Institute, and it looks at the water stress forecast, and it's forecasting 20 years from today. Oh, by the way, Hassan, if you can delete these red lines, I don't know, somebody drew them on. I think you can remove those if you want. Okay, so the Indus Basin is, as you can imagine, has extremely high water stress forecasted for the year 2040, and most of Pakistan is going to be fairly significantly impacted as a result of that. So that means our demand is going to be far exceeding the amount of water which the river has as a run-of-river availability is going to be exceeded. Okay. And I think part of the problem is the public perceptions around what the issues are, and the media play a fairly significant role in this. And one example is that when we published this book a couple of years ago, we reached out to media, and we said that this book is charting a path to cooperation, and there's great potential for Indus Basin development if India, Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan work together. And of course, India, Pakistan, and China are nuclear powers, so there is a very serious threat that needs to be addressed. However, when the news came out in the various international media, the story was very different, and basically everyone was saying the UN experts are warning about a water war between Asian nuclear powers, and there's a threat of nuclear war. And this was kind of covered in about 20 different languages and close to 50 different newspapers and websites. So again, people get more attracted to sensational news then they perceive the benefits from cooperation, because that doesn't sell news. Negative news sell newspapers much better. Okay, so let me now come to the third part of my talk and talk about what the opportunities are. So I've so far been talking about problems and what was not there in the Indus Water Treaty and what the consequences are. So let's start with looking at some political realities of where we are and how they might influence our sort of decision-making processes and our negotiation processes. So the problem is that the water cooperation, particularly between India and Pakistan, has quite a few handicaps because of the geopolitical situation, because of, for example, the Kashmir problem, which hasn't really been resolved and it keeps getting worse. And conflict is so deeply ingrained that it's kind of hard to bring about change. In spite of these difficulties, there is quite a few cooperative instruments which are available. And I said earlier on that there's at least 4 significant areas where cooperation can take place. And implementation of these cooperative instruments around these 4 areas, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the international experts who collaborated on that book that I mentioned earlier, they all felt that it was in the realm of possibilities. So it's not really totally impossible. And also, if these riparian states are not cooperating, the consequences are going to be quite severe for all of them, not just for India and Pakistan. China and Afghanistan also have to pay attention to what's going on in the Indus Basin. And those penalties might not just be in terms of water, but they might lead to social, economic, and political unrest as well. So the first area is climate change cooperation. And as I was saying earlier, for example, we don't really know what the long-term impacts of climate change on the monsoon trends will be. We don't know what's happening to the glaciers, and they have consequences for predicting stream flow, etc. At a minimum, and this is of interest to all countries, to cooperate on understanding and collecting information, utilizing remote sensing tools, which are now quite easily available, and to develop these forecasting models, which take the regional climate scale models and they zoom them down to the basin level. And this will help us in significantly better planning for futures that might be coming our way. Similarly, at the moment, India and Pakistan don't collaborate at all when we are sitting at the negotiating table on climate change, which from a purely scientific standpoint doesn't make any sense at all, because the climate change impacts are going to be similarly affecting, well, not just India and Pakistan, but also China and Afghanistan. So it would actually make sense for us to form a common position and actually work together as a bloc. And again, these kind of common negotiations are quite possible. We have examples of that happening in other parts of the world. The second area is the joint responses to water-related disasters. And the most common ones are related to flooding. And I think we need to bring kind of a regional focus and building regional mechanisms for responding to disasters. We know that neither of the country has enough capacity of their own to deal with major flood events. We have seen this in Pakistan in 2010, in 2014, 2015. Continuously, these large flooding events overwhelmed the capacity in Pakistan. We've similarly seen extreme floods, I believe, in 2017 in the Indian-held Kashmir. And again, India didn't have the capacity to deal with it either. So to deal with these common problems, if we form a common mechanism for dealing with it, that again is quite logical, and I think it will also offer opportunities for track two diplomacy uh, as a result of creating these kind of opportunities. And in order to do that, uh, you can set up real-time data sharing. For example, uh, you can also set up some joint mechanisms that respond to emergencies for disaster relief, particularly. The third area is sharing of energy grids. Now, this may sound, I think, quite radical to some of you, but Pakistan is Pakistan and India are kind of an anomaly, that they don't have shared energy grid, which again, purely from an economic standpoint, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And there are all these energy corridors that are already being set up between Central Asia, and they're going through Pakistan. There's also the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. Again, not moving forward very rapidly, but the point is that there are these energy corridors that we can benefit from. And by having shared energy grid, you can also facilitate more holistic negotiations, because when you're talking about just water sharing, it makes it a little bit more difficult. But when you throw energy sharing into the mix, the negotiations um, become significantly easier. And actually, by having this shared energy grid, you can also draw overseas development assistance and foreign direct investment into this region. So again, it's a benefit to both countries. And finally, we can also think of using these river tributaries or these river systems as an opportunity for trading. And at the moment, we don't really use the rivers for transportation in any significant way. But again, we need to think a bit outside of our traditional box or the thinking. And this would be connected to various aspects of industrial development. And once you start using it for navigation, you can also uh, benefit overall what the economic benefits of a block of this size can have. If we compare the size of the market, for example, if you look at the South Asia as a whole, that's about the size of European Union in terms of just the dollar amount. But we don't have nowhere that level of clout, just because there's no cohesion in the economic policies. So again, trading through the rivers and using them for navigation purposes can open up that opportunity. Okay, so that's kind of my four proposals for the kind of things that can take place. But there are some other political realities that I alluded to earlier. Let me start by talking about what the objectives would be for both Pakistan and India if we were to go and revise the Indus Water Treaty. So from Pakistan, we certainly want to secure our water supply for future, for agriculture, for urban centers. You want to have enough water available so that you can adapt to the various changing climate conditions. Um, at least from Pakistan's standpoint, you want to bring in China and Afghanistan into the equation. It will change the nature of the relationship overall. And also, please keep in mind that China is at the head of the river basin as a whole. So it changes the relationship because India then becomes a downstream country. At the moment in the Indus Water Treaty, it's the only upstream country. So those dynamics change. We should be interested in generating sufficient energy, and you can easily imagine going up to 42,000 megawatts, and a lot of that actually coming from hydropower collectively in the basin. So again, not just in Pakistan, but I'm talking about the Indus Basin as a whole. And you also want to create economic opportunities for Pakistan in terms of poverty alleviation and human development. But the question is, why would India want to do this? And again, I've had my students look at some of these aspects, and here's what they came up on. Uh, why would India be interested? So, in a way, by achieving a better operating Indus Water Treaty, it actually helps India in terms of its own regional security and solidifies its influence. It can secure more energy. As I said, there's already 33 projects in various stages of planning in Kashmir alone. It can actually help boost India's economic footprint. And for example, if you had a shared energy grid and you also had open trading taking place through the river basin, that can actually benefit India more than probably they realize. And there are a number of technology based solutions, particularly India has been very performing very well in the tech sector, and that can be brought to bear on these kind of issues. On climate change as well as water management, by repositioning its stance towards the Indus Basin, it can actually help achieve more of a leadership role, at a minimum in the South Asian region, probably across the world as well. So that there is a bit of a carrot, yeah, that can be dangled in front of the Indian leadership to say it's in your interest to reconsider and redesign the Indus Water Treaty. How would you go about doing it is the question, and uh, that question. Sorry, I'm just going to delete these. So this could be done by scrapping the Indus Water Treaty and devising a brand new treaty. Now that's the probably the most difficult route, and it probably will take at least a decade to get that done. But it has some benefits. So you can include all the modern water sharing concepts, and you can engage China and Afghanistan, and you can probably bring in new international support for a redesign in this water treaty. The downside is that it will take a long time. There's a problem of collapse of negotiation is a real potential, and there may be new pressures, particularly on Pakistan, because it's downstream of all the other countries. There might be some new pressures on taking water away from what is already allocated to Pakistan. So there is some real risks in doing that. We can also go to the route of creating new annexes to the Indus Water Treaty. And this is kind of the path of least resistance, and you can bring in other outside actors, and the 1997 Water Courses Convention can be used to define how to redesign this. And then the third option is to develop totally separate MOUs or agreements to deal with those specific issues that I spoke about earlier. So again, there might be some benefit in doing that, but that basically leaves you to deal with the problems piecemeal rather than in an integrated way. So there might be some suboptimal outcomes as a result of that fragmentation of your negotiation process. Okay, so let me conclude. I'm coming up close to an hour, so just some final thoughts to leave you with. Oops, sorry, jumped too long. I want to leave you with some arguments about why the world should care about what's happening in the Indus Basin and what is it that they can do. So let me take the first part of that. Uh, I think the region is quite significant for global geopolitics. As I said earlier, there's 3 nuclear armed countries. There's the Kashmir conflict, which has been there for decades. The Afghanistan conflict has been there for decades. And there are all these energy corridors that are going to go through, which, of course, the international energy community has a lot of interest in. And there's also a sort of an influence of China, because it's now fast moving to become the most globally dominant power. So that will also be something that needs to be taken into account. There is, of course, history of armed conflict. India and Pakistan are the obvious ones, and now we've seen China and India also can edge in that direction. And there is a considerable risk of political instability, and the if you heed the warnings of the U.S. intelligence community assessment, these are quite serious consequences. And so the international community has to sit back and ask themselves, is failure really an option that they want to live with? So that's the issue. So what is it that they should do? Of course, international assistance immediately comes to mind, and I think the world views Afghanistan, China, India, and Pakistan very differently. China, of course, is no longer receiving development aid because it is the second largest economy in the world now. Afghanistan is unfortunately considered a bit of a basket case, so that limits what can be done. India and Pakistan, again, are quite different again in that context. But nonetheless, there is an opportunity for the international community to bring in financial, technological, human resources, institutional support to make things better. They can also help broker relationships between the riparian countries, all four of them. And I didn't really talk much about the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But a significant fraction of the world population is in this space, and so the international community can help them achieve the SDGs, and that indirectly also includes many water-related targets underneath the various SDGs. And the international organizations like the UN and World Bank are already engaged. There's also a role for SAARC, maybe even for ASEAN, although Pakistan and India don't really fall under ASEAN directly. And then there are newer institutions like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, basically initiated between Russia and China, and a number of other countries in Central Asia are a part of it. So that also offers an interesting platform through which the world can engage. And then there is a number of research organizations that operate from within the region. So again, if you have time, we can come back to those and talk about them. So here's my final thought to leave with you. What is that we can do as engineers in this overall equation? So there's some very specific areas where I think there's lots of potential for engagement of engineers in the water sector, generally speaking, internationally, but certainly in the Indus Basin. So energy sharing design of grids, hydropower generation, energy storage, I think, is becoming a big topic now, particularly as we move towards more renewable energy sources, which are not as on and off type resources like hydropower or like thermal energy generation. Energy storage becomes an important issue, and there's lots of engineering designs around dams that can address that. The second big area is use of artificial intelligence, machine learning to understand and forecast what kind of outcomes there might be, and particularly analysis of trends and patterns using big data approaches, I think, can lead to some very interesting ways of viewing where we are going and how we might plan for different development activities. The third big area is innovations around monitoring. And again, I'll subdivide those into two. There's quite a lot of development being done in terms of real-time sensors that can look at water quality, and they can give you a real feed for how much pollutants, for example, are going into river systems. The second one is remote sensing tools, and that means use of drones or satellite imagery. Again, these are tools which are now easily available and accessible, and we can think of using them for different purposes. And the fourth main area is disaster response technologies, and I had already talked about disaster risk reduction as a major area
I think there is a connectivity issue with the host, with the trainer. So please bear with us and we'll be online shortly. Use screen, use monitor on the screen. So what's wrong? अच्छा, ये हुआ है मेरे को। We'll treat this as the 5 minute break, which should have been, which is a part of before the Q&A. So, and you can ask your questions over here. We're ready for the question answer session shortly.
नहीं मतलब दफ्तर जो है ना वो कहते हैं अभी अभी उनको जो मेरी उनसे बात हो रही थी वो उनको ले रहे हैं वो आईपैड के थ्रू भी हुए थे इस पे भी तो जहाँ से करना है ना वहाँ से भी उनको भी करने लगे
Gee, sorry, I don't know why I got disconnected.
No, welcome back, G. All right. I think you were shared the part of the screen. Okay. Doctor, please share your screen. All right.
Gee, I think I was done. I was all the way to the end.
Okay, then I think we can. Should we start the question answer session?
Sure. Yeah, I was seeing a lot of questions being posted on chat, but I was more or less ignoring it. So if you had posted questions, please feel free to state them.
All right. We'll start with some of the basic because we have a lot of questions for related to in this water treaty. But in the beginning, we'll start with there's a question: as the population keeps increasing, water problems will keep getting worse. Is there some long-term solution to water scarcity issues?
Gee, sorry, I've stopped sharing my screen. So yes, the long-term issue is demand management, basically. So that means we have to really look at a national water policy that looks at agricultural water usage, urban water usage, recasts how agriculture, the irrigation water is used, invest quite heavily in technologies. So I think it's that demand part which has to be reduced. That's in a nutshell, and I can expand on that more if you want, but that's where we have to start. The demand has to be reduced because, as whoever asked the question, yes, the supply is going to get more and more limited over time, on a per person basis.
So can technologies and research like GMO help in educating the amount of water used or hydroponics kind of technologies and high drip irrigation? How much are they helping in controlling the water?
I think so there's two types of technological innovations that need to be put in. One is at the end user level, so that's where farmers can put in, as you say, hydroponics or drip irrigation, I guess, is a major infrastructural investment that needs to go in. It's not a new technology. The other one is the technological advancement in water storage and delivery. As you probably know, we lose in our canal system, we lose something like 45% of water through seepage. So that has to be rethought. That cannot continue. You cannot keep losing year after year, over 40% of the water and still complain that we don't have enough water. So I think that's where the rethinking part has to come in at the national scale. You have to bring together provinces to sit down across the table, and you have to negotiate what that new model looks like. And you need major investment, particularly I think from the federal government, has to come in to change that equation.
Okay, I'll come to you with one more question, and then will head over to the Indus Basin Treaty questions, which are a lot. There is another question that there's a suggestion in a recent study. There's been suggested that US and European Union are major factors and responsible for the global breakdown, climate breakdown, to the tune of 40% to 29% respectively. So your comments are on this.
Well, yes, that's generally true. And the main mechanism for addressing climate change was through the Paris Accord, or the Paris Climate Agreement, that was signed in December 2015. Apart from other things and setting targets for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, I think there was an important element in there which is relevant to this discussion. And that was to create a green climate fund where all the developed countries will put in money to the tune of $100 billion a year. In principle, that the idea was that money and $100 billion a year after year, is actually a lot of money. And the notion was that some of it will be used for innovations around energy and innovations in technological development for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But some fraction of it was to go towards adaptation, and that means investments into technologies and infrastructure. And water resource management is a very significant part of that adaptation cycle. So yes, the contributors to climate change, at least in a historic sense, were certainly European countries and the US. Lately, in the last few decades, China and India have also been contributing significant amounts of greenhouse gases. But there is a mechanism, at least, that was set up in Paris to address that. Now, the real world problem is that there's people like Trump who can pull the US out of that agreement altogether. And the last time I looked at the Green Climate Fund, the commitments were, I think, of the order of $11 billion. And US was supposed to be a major contributor. I would say at least a quarter of those $100 billion was to come from the US. So they have withdrawn, as you know, and that withdrawal will actually become formal in December of this year. So last year in December, Trump announced that they're pulling out, and there's a 1-year period that was stipulated in the agreement itself. So the reality is that those funds are not going to be available at the same level at which the world had promised. Nonetheless, the Indus Basin still has the opportunity to go to the Green Climate Fund and get funds, flowing to the Indus Basin. And again, it would actually help quite a bit if India and Pakistan were going in together. I mean, I know it sounds really very difficult in the current political environment, but that's really, if you look at the reality of the situation and think seriously, that's the way you have to go.
Okay, now as you started with the Indus Basin, let's come over to the Indus Water Treaty. We have a lot of questions, and I'll give it to you in parts. Firstly, was the treaty a mistake? Was it good or bad for Pakistan? And if it was a mistake, or we're dealing with these issues, So was it a political management or establishment's fault that they didn't knew what they were getting into?
Okay, actually, अच्छा सवाल है. It's complicated because I said when the negotiation process started in the early 1950s, the objective was very different. The objective was collaborative sharing, and you ended up with essentially a partition of the river basin. So you said, okay, Satluj, Bias, and Ravi go to India and they can do whatever they want, and they compensate Pakistan, and the remaining rivers stay with Pakistan. So that, I think, strategically was probably not the right way to go. Now, whose mistake was it? I think that's a very difficult question to answer. Whether it was the political leadership that did not foresee the benefits of having a shared management system, or whether it was other factors influencing that outcome. I know for one thing, and I have spoken to people in the World Bank who were part of those negotiations, and they were, I guess, to some extent disappointed that the Indus Water Treaty didn't end up looking like what they wanted it to be. Now, whether it was a total mistake and whether how much it relates to the current problems with water management we see in India and Pakistan, I have a more sort of nuanced answer to that. I think there are certainly quite a lot of strengths inside the Indus Water Treaty, and one significant strength is that it has actually held together even when India and Pakistan have been at war in 65 and 71, and during the Kargil conflict as well. So there is some institutional strength to it, and I think we shouldn't, as they say here, we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, meaning that there's lots of good that should be retained. But is it sufficient to meet today's challenges after almost 60 years later? And the answer is no. And that's why I'm arguing that it needs to be changed. It needs to be reformed. Unfortunately, um, on the Pakistani side, and I think we have more to gain from revising the Indus Water Treaty, those discussions are not taking place. And I don't fully understand the reason for that. Maybe it's the political environment, maybe it's the conflict with India, which blinds us to see what the opportunities are. Anyway, but I'll keep saying that we need to reconsider the Indus Water Treaty, and we have to rethink of ways to redesign it so that it can meet our demands today and for next 50 or 60 years as well.
What would you suggest if you were in you would be in future if some kind you're in the position? What would you suggest should be the considerations of the Indus Water Treaty in your perspective?
So
For future Pakistan and India, where should it go?
So I think there's three big things that need to happen for Indus Water Treaty to really work. The first one is that we need to bring in China and Afghanistan inside the fold. They have to be part of the overall negotiation. And like I said, it changes the dynamics, particularly when you bring in China. And I think it sort of breaks the more sort of stronger upstream role that India is now playing. So that's one big change. Secondly, we need to incorporate climate change related impacts and changes to the water flows into the equation, meaning that you have to create a dynamic mechanism that allows you to consider each and every project, for example, that's being set up by India. You want to now discuss this in the current situation. So just saying that you're going to maintain the base flow in the Neelam River, and therefore India can produce the Kishan-Ganga hydroelectric project because it's going to ensure that in the Neelam-Jhelum River there would be sufficient base flow at all times. That's probably not a good argument anymore. So you have to create those dynamic mechanisms inside the treaty that can look at the climate change impacts and say what was stipulated 60 years ago is not valid anymore. So you can even think of setting up a common system where you are conducting joint research on those issues. And the third big area, as I said before, is disaster relief and disaster response. I think in this one, we really do have to bring the four countries together to say we create a common task force. And the purpose of that is to bring resources whenever there's a flood or even a drought anywhere in the basin, there has to be a joint response. Because really, India, large as it is, even they don't have the capacity to deal with some of the large flooding events. And those flooding events are going to get worse as a result of climate change. So those are the three sort of big things that I would argue need to be added to the treaty.
As you said that China should be brought into the Indus Water Treaty, there's a question that in the Indus Basin, Satluj and Indus rivers as originate from China, but these rivers do not carry significant flow contribution from the Chinese territory as compared to overall means of annual flow of the Indus Basin.
Right.
And the second part is that specifically the topography along the Indus in China is not friendly for development. So how could be what could be the possibilities for China to have a direct impact in the Indus Basin related to Indus?
Yes, the topography is not favorable to China, but that is not stopping them from planning dams to be built in that area for both water storage as well as hydropower generation. So they do have an interest. Now, and with China, I think it's going to be particularly tricky because, as I said, I gave the example of the Mekong River Basin and the Brahmaputra Basin. There's actually a fourth basin, the name escapes me right now, that goes through Myanmar, where again China is the upstream country, and China doesn't have a tradition of participating in these multi-party negotiations, so it will be difficult. But the advantage we have is that we have a very friendly relationship, and this kind of negotiation can be folded in the context of CPEC. So I think there is a possibility to bring them into the conversation. So there is an interest on their part, even if the fraction of the volume of water which is contributed is relatively small, but it is still significant for China's purposes.
Weather ready. Sorry. Lastly, the last question is that even with a lot of dialogues between Pakistan and India, and still India is constantly constructing dams, neglecting Pakistan water rights. What forum do you suggest we should approach or go to stop this? And then I'll.
So the issue is that the forum actually is available within the Indus Water Treaty. You can have an external expert appointed. You can go to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and you can even go to the International Court of Justice. The issue is this, and that's why I think from the tone of the question, I think that there is a sense of frustration that Pakistan has been perceived to not effectively prevent India from building these projects, or our somehow national interest has been impacted. And that to some extent is true, but I think the underlying problem, and this is my opinion, I could be wrong on this, my opinion is that the negotiation process has been quite imperfect, if I can put it mildly, from Pakistan. So we have not had good international lawyers on our side. Our case has not been well presented. The data that are required to build that case have not been well presented. So it's not that the mechanisms are not available or we need to create a brand new mechanism to solve some of these problems. The issue is that the we have been quite ineffective in engaging the mechanisms we have, and I'm not sure what the reasons are. It could be political interference in the operation of the Indus Water Commission, Indus River Commission. It could be the inability and lack of planning on part of Pakistan, and the expertise. And I don't want to name any institutions or organization, but that kind of planning has not been there. So, for example, when we were negotiating or we were discussing the case on the Kishanganga hydroelectric project, one of the arguments was that we would want to build the Jhelum Neelam project. But the point is that we had done nothing on that project, so our position was quite weak in negotiating that water should be coming to Pakistan, because we want to do a similar diversion as what India did for the Kishanganga project. So I think there's certain weaknesses on our side which are exacerbating these problems. So it's not that the mechanisms are not there, it's that we are ineffective in using those mechanisms.
Okay, one more, because I think this is a good question for us. What can be contributed by an engineering organization like NESPA in all of water issues and water related? How do you advise NESPA to make a contribution?
Yeah, so I think there's two types of sort of strategic contributions, and I'm not talking about being engaged in specific projects. One is that there's a need for having a national scale dialogue on water resources and what happens to water. And like I was saying, at least in my view, there's 3 or 4 major reforms that need to be introduced into the national development planning processes. Now, NASPAC is one of the strongest institutions, in the engineering realm in Pakistan, and I think it has that credibility that it can contribute to, or it can even lead those kind of national dialogues. So it has to go sort of outside the envelope a little bit in terms of not just thinking of working as consulting engineers on different projects, but actually to think of the engineering domain as a whole at a larger scale. And I think that's one type of contribution to either contribute to, or my opinion would be to even lead this process of national water policy. That could be done. Secondly, I think in terms of the various engineering options and building of scenarios using sophisticated models, and I had talked about artificial intelligence and machine learning that would give us the kind of tools for planning on the one side, then it will also give us the tools for negotiation and even conflict resolution with India or with Afghanistan or China for that matter. So building those tools is, again, I think, within the purview of an engineering organization that I think there is a leadership opportunity there to create those tools, because you will probably not readily get a contract, say, from the federal government to say go and build those tools. If you actually demonstrate what possibilities there are for advanced machine learning be applied to forecasting the water futures in Pakistan, I think that would create a lot of great value.
All right, with that, I will invite Umar Faruqa, because the question and answer session is concluded. And Umar Sahab, your few words.
Gee, all right. Thank you very much, Ji. Assalamu alaikum. On behalf of NESPAC, Dr. Zafar Adeel, we'd like to thank you very much for your time and for, especially since you're in Canada and it's almost midnight at your end. And we really appreciate your time and your effort to actually give to us an insight into what the reality is of the water scarcity. And I hope as engineers and related people, we are very much, kind of stressed out at what is the reality with this India-Pakistan kind of Indus Water Treaty and how we should go about into helping out Pakistan in major catastrophe that we might face in times to come. Maybe not in our time, but maybe in our children's time, there will be real issues. So at the end, I appreciate your time and I appreciate your thoughts that you shared with us. And one more thing that I would like you to do, like I was talking before, how can you help us as students, as NESPAC employees, uh, in kind of getting to kind of improve our understanding of the subject and to improve our maybe some lectures or some sort of online training courses that you might offer because you're a professor in your university, and I know that you do kind of share some students from Pakistan also, since NESPAC is a great great engineering consultancy. We'd appreciate if you could kind of make it an official kind of thing. Maybe we could kind of send our people to learn, and your projects would be we're doing a lot of projects in agriculture. I'm sure I'm not sure if the head of our WNA section is here, but they have done really good work in this kind of in this water, understanding the flows and the problems. So if you have certain projects that you could share with us, so that people from our company can do some 2 months, 3 months training program with you, with somebody else, we'd appreciate that. And with that, thank you very much. I'm going to mute myself, and Dr. Zafar Adeel will have the last word before we shut off. Thank you very much.
Okay. बहुत शुक्रिया उमर। मैं सवाल का जवाब देने से पहले एक दो और बातें कहना चाहता हूँ। एक तो ये कि सबसे पहले बहुत शुक्रिया, ये बड़ा अच्छा मौका है अपने जो इंजीनियरिंग कम्युनिटी है पाकिस्तान में उसके साथ कनेक्ट होने के लिए, और मेरी हमेशा से कोशिश रही है कि ये राब्ते जो हैं ये रखे जाएं, और जब मैं यूएन में था तब भी, और अब जब कि मैं एकेडेमिया में हूँ तो ये राब्ते जो हैं हमेशा से रहे हैं और कायम रखे हैं। मिसाल के तौर पे 2013 में हमने जीसी यूनिवर्सिटी के साथ एक इंडस के ऊपर कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑर्गेनाइज करवाई थी। तो बहुत शुक्रिया ये अपॉर्चुनिटी क्रिएट करने का। और इसमें फिर ये है कि जो जैसे मैंने कहा, जो मेरी प्रेजेंटेशन है वो सबके साथ शेयर कर लें प्लीज़, और जो मेरी कॉन्टैक्ट इन्फॉर्मेशन है वो भी आप शेयर कर सकते हैं। मुझे इनडायरेक्टली उम्मीद ये थी कि हो सकता है कि इस इंटरेक्शन की वजह से कोई हमारे आपस में राब्ते बढ़े, कोई आपस में प्रोफेशनल जो अमूर है उनके ऊपर कोई डिस्कशन हो सके जिससे कोलैबोरेशन के रास्ते खुलें। तो my door is always open for that. I'm always very happy. Now, in terms of coming back to your question, what are the kind of opportunities? I'll speak about opportunities in general, and then specifically from my own Pacific Water Research Center. Generally, I think there's a number of institutions that we align with. For example, there's an institution in Netherlands called IHE, which is I think the world's premier institution for developing water related experts. And I wouldn't be surprised if many of the people here have actually been through that institution. So that's a great sort of foundational organization, and I would really suggest that you look into that. There's also a number of other institutions, one at University of Dundee that looks at international water law. And in the context of my presentation here, I would say that Pakistan certainly needs much better international water lawyers. So I know it's a little bit of a stretch to ask engineers to look into water law, but I think there's a natural synergy that we should be looking into. Now, specifically for my center, there's a couple of opportunities that I'll mention. We have a program where my center has funding from the Canadian government called the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship for Advanced Scholars. And it's open for people who are either in PhD programs or are early graduates or early part of their careers after completing a PhD. So either PhD candidates or postdocs are eligible, and we have reached out to different universities in Pakistan. Last year, we had somebody from UET come and spend, I think, about 5.5 months at my university. And so that was a great experience for us, and I'm sure he also benefited quite a bit. And we had now somebody from Bahauddin Zakaria University, and we had somebody from University of Agriculture in Faisalabad were sort of in a waiting pattern. And now because of this COVID-19 pandemic, we are not able to bring those people in even when they have Canadian visas. So that's a very specific opportunity, and it's only for people who either are in a PhD program or have recently completed one. So if there are people, colleagues in NASPAC who fit that criteria, I would say please reach out to me and we can talk about the possibility. This pandemic, inshallah, will be over in the next 3, 4, 5 months, whatever the time frame is, and we will reopen. We have a lot of those funds still sitting with us, and we would like to love to bring people from Pakistan into that program. We also have academic programs, and again, if there's interest in courses, for example, right now I was mentioning to your colleagues that I'm teaching a course in water security, and now that everything has gone virtual, I think it's easy to have people from Pakistan participate in those type of courses. So I think there's now that door has opened up for that type of participation as well. So again, if somebody is interested in academic programs, particularly at the graduate level for a master's degree or a PhD degree, please do reach out to me, and we can discuss specifics of where you can fit. And my interest is always finding out research areas which you can take back to Pakistan and which will benefit Pakistan directly. So that's kind of where I would come in on those kind of opportunities. So that's kind of the answer to your question, Umar. There's specific opportunities with my university and with my research center. Again, through you, or if anyone wants to contact me directly, that's also possible. I'd be quite happy to follow through.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Zafar, for your time, and to all the participants. There's an open invitation of collaboration, not just in academic collaboration, but proper advice that lead the world, lead engineering, and lead the water issues. And NESPAC should take the first step and should go up and beyond. HR is available for all of you if you want, if you guys are interested. We'll also get further feedback from Dr. Saab in these courses and trainings. So we're here for you whenever you require. Sir, thank you for your time, and I know it's very late, and thank you to all the participants for joining in. Allah Hafiz will.
Ji, bahut shukriya. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.